What's the deal with them CrossBros? The Genoese Crossbow is a unique unit available to the Knights Templar civilization in Castle Age. They come with the commandery for the Republic of Genoa. At first glance they seem quite similar to the regular crossbows. However, there's a lot of differences there which we're going to try and explore in this video. The easiest point of comparison would be the regular crossbowman. Compared to that, the Genoese crossbow has substantially more HP and maybe more importantly a much higher baseline damage. There's also bonus damage happening, but instead of being applied to all heavy units, it's only applied to a melee infantry. The high base damage means that the Genoese crossbows are much better against most units, but there are, however, some unit types where the regular crossbows actually do quite a lot better than the Genoese crossbows. And I think that's one of the most important points of this video, is making that distinction where the regular crossbows are actually still better than the Genoese crossbows. The Genoese crossbows have one extra range and one extra range armor. Both of those things are relatively subtle, but are actually quite impactful, as we're about to see in the long run. This, of course, comes at an increased cost, which at 80 food and 100 gold is quite substantial. It lines itself up as one of those units that Knights Templars have that just take a ton of gold to build, which of course leans into the pilgrim mechanic that the Knights Templar have, which does provide them with a very unique gold source that is technically infinite. In order to gauge the strength of these various crossbows, let's just put them up against each other. In this case it's 2 versus 3 to make it even resources. For the rest of this video, I'm gonna put the Genoese crossbow up against other units of the game. However, unlike the last videos, they're not just gonna be the only units going up against them. Given that they are ranged units, they do quite poorly against melee units when unmicroed, because they would normally stutter step backwards or have a kind of buffer unit in between themselves and the enemy melee units. I've excluded both of those things from these tests, I think, because it's really not the performance of the Genoese crossbow that I'm interested in, but the Genoese crossbow compared to the regular crossbow. We're just going to look at all of these matchups, both for the Genoese crossbow and the regular crossbow, in order to compare the two. And that's what we're seeing here with these Spearmen. These are 720 resources, both for the crossbows and the Spearmen. And while both of them are going to lose, as we see here, the Genoese crossbows do substantially better. Kind of an expected result, but I think the comparison still is interesting. Maybe more interesting of a comparison is this matchup against a Horseman. Now, neither of these units deal bonus damage to them and are actually kind of getting annihilated by them. This is where I'm gonna break with another rule that I've set up for the other videos, where I'm gonna put the Horsemen at a resource disadvantage here, because I think in an uneven matchup, the difference in performance becomes much more clear. As we can see here, the Genoese crossbows kill the Horsemen relatively quickly without even losing one of the two, whereas the regular crossbows struggle very hard and only barely finish off the singular Horseman in the end. From that we can tell that the Genoese crossbows, while not good against Horsemen, are much better against them than the regular crossbows are. Knights are a key unit in the early stages of the Castle Age, which is right around the time where you unlock the crossbows. So honestly, if you're gonna remember only one matchup from this video, it should be this one. The regular crossbows kill these two lances very quickly here, as the Genoese crossbows continue to struggle for quite a while. And I think this one matters a lot, because oftentimes you really want to have crossbows as an anti-heavy cavalry unit, and the regular crossbows just outshine the Genoese in that regard by a lot. I'm gonna go into more detail on why knights matter this much later. We're also gonna see this with the following units here. Keshiks that have been upgraded to veteran also do very well against the Genoese crossbows, while getting defeated by the regular crossbows. The lack of bonus damage from the Genoese crossbows causes the Keshiks to be alive for a lot longer and get a lot more lifesteal in, which makes them even better against the Genoese crossbows than regular lancers. I also included an even resource matchup from these crossbows against sofas here, just to show that yes, without micro the crossbows lose to these heavy melee cavalry units, just to show that you do actually still need micro or, a couple of spearmen in the way. But even without micro, the regular crossbows still do better against the heavy cavalry units. The final heavy cavalry unit we're gonna look at here are these war elephants. They are classified as heavy and therefore do take bonus damage from the regular crossbows, but do not take bonus damage from the Genoese crossbows. Interestingly enough, the splash damage actually kind of hurts the regular crossbows a little bit more as they are smaller, and the regular crossbows do deal more damage to them, but it's actually kind of an even matchup. Probably more interesting though is this matchup against this ranged elephant. The ranged elephant is actually an anti-ranged unit, as it has a ton of ranged armor, and despite being, you know, a big old motherfucker and completely clad in armor, is not classified as a heavy unit, and therefore does not take bonus damage from the regular crossbows. So here, surprisingly, at least to my surprise, the Genoese crossbows do much better against this ranged elephant than the normal crossbows. This means that Genoese crossbows technically counter tower elephants, which is not a factoid I had in my mind, or is something that I would not have at all expected, which I think is kind of cool. And it's also one more reason to pick them against Delhi, actually. I've also included this palace elephant. These are the special Imperial Age unit that Delhi gets from their landmark at the very late game. And those are just some OP motherfuckers, honestly, because they also aren't heavy and just straight up win against both of these crossbows, which, you know, they're strong. Get some spears, get some horsemen in there. Crossbows aren't the way to go, since they're not heavy units at all. The next section, we're gonna look at melee infantry units, going from heavy to light. We start out, of course, with the very basic man-at-arms. And since both of these crossbows are, you know, kind of designed to counter this kind of unit, I wasn't sure who would do it better here. And yeah, I think if we look at the final result of these battles, yes, there are 4 men-at-arms alive at the top, but they are much weaker than the 3 at the bottom, so really it's more a difference in how the damage was spread out. But overall, I think these two units did basically equally well against the men-at-arms. Pretty much the same as what we're gonna see here with these Palace Guards. They are basically just a faster version of the man-at-arms. The Palace Guards also, of course, win against the unmicroed ranged units, but take a very similar amount of damage compared to what the regular man-at-arms did. All in all, the Palace Guards do slightly worse than the man-at-arms, which is just due to the fact that their increased movement speed is not as much of a factor in these straight-up duels. Kind of a strange matchup was this against the Serjeants. It would only come up in some of the Knights Templar mirrors. They are not the most popular commandery to pick in Feudal Age, so this would not be terribly common matchup. But I think, for what it's worth, it's quite interesting to note that the regular crossbows do much better against them than the Genoese ones, despite the fact that both of these units deal bonus damage to them. And I'm not actually quite sure why that is. It might just be because the Sergeants tend to do overkill, but less so on the Genoese crossbows because of their higher HP pool. I'm not sure. The first unit combination that I thought of when I saw the Genoese crossbows was what I call Japanese infantry trail mix. That's usually a combination of Onabugeisha, samurai, and sometimes spearmen. The advantage there being, of course, that the regular crossbows only deal bonus damage to the samurai and not spearmen or Onabugeisha. However, the Genoese crossbows deal bonus damage to all of them. So I thought, oh, that's what they're designed to counter. And they do, in the end, do significantly better here. But it's not as much of a blowout as I'd actually hoped. So, you know, but still, that's kind of the role they fulfill. Now, a matchup where the difference actually is quite drastic is against these, you know, so-called ball dudes, which are Jushi specialty unit. They are an oddball unit, as they're one of the few units that basically don't take bonus damage from anyone except the Genoese crossbows. And we can see that the Genoese crossbows kind of nail them to the wall very quickly. I did forget to activate the ability that makes them take half damage from ranged, so kind of an unfair matchup, but still the Genoese crossbows do much better against them than any archer would do. Moving over to the light infantry now. Now, it obviously should be said that these are best countered by archers, not by crossbows at all, but since the Genoese crossbows do deal bonus damage to these Musofadi Warroirs, in the end they do slightly better against them anyway. Up top we have about 6.5 Musofadi Warroirs surviving, while at the bottom it's just over 4, so actually quite a significant difference here, even if it's hard to tell. A much closer matchup is this one against the Landsknechte. Now it's obvious that when it comes to Landsknechte you always want to snipe them really before they get into range, but this example kind of showed me just how terrifying those guys can be. And yeah, unsurprisingly, the Genoese Crossbows are better for this, because they deal bonus damage and can target them down at a higher range. So always target the Landsknechte first. Now moving over to ranged infantry in general, we're gonna start of course out with the basic bitch archer. For these matchups, it's very important to remember that the Genoese Crossbows have 1 ranged armor as well as 1 extra range. And we can see this in effect already in this first clip, where only 4 archers survive against the Genoese Crossbows, while about 8 survive against the regular archers. Now keep in mind that one of the ways that crossbows actually get countered in practice is basically just the enemy archers targeting down your crossbows. And for those scenarios, the ranged armor is very helpful, but I think also the extra range is actually very significant. As you can see here against longbows, in a practical fight it would be much easier for the Genoese crossbows to fire at the enemy melee units while staying out of range for the enemy archers. I think that's actually kind of a pretty big win for the Genoese here. Zhuge Nu, of course famous for firing 3 arrows from their crossbows and have very high DPS, but are also, affected by ranged armor 3 times as hard. So unsurprisingly, here they also do worse against the Genoese crossbows, which again, kinda shows this trend of Genoese crossbows being better against ranged units. We can now check if this holds true against these Janissaries. Neither of these units is technically designed to counter the others, so I was actually not sure how this matchup was gonna go. And we can see that both crossbows end up winning, but the Genoese crossbows do so much more confidently. Again, being better against ranged units. Yeah, while a lot of the matchups that we've seen have been kind of predictable, or at least the kind of stuff that I would have expected, the fact that Genoese crossbows are good against ranged units is actually something I didn't know before making this, so, at least I learned something, if nobody else did. I also included this late game matchup against Handcannoneers. Both sides here have university upgrades, and yeah, the Genoese crossbows actually kill them slightly slower, but in the end it's kind of a destruction. The lesson to learn here really is don't let anything touch your Handcannoneers. They're way too expensive and they always need to be buffered. Next up, we're up against Mangudai. Mangudai are harassment-centered units, so any ranged units will do well against them, really. I wanted to include this here anyway, though, because I think one of the primary strategies for the Mangudai is to stay out of range, which is much harder against the Genoese crossbows. And also, I actually sped up the top footage just because it took the regular crossbows that much longer to kill these Mangudai. So, any of these matchups where neither crossbow deals bonus damage, the Genoese crossbows actually do significantly better. There is, however, one exception to this rule. Horsearchers are a ranged cavalry unit from Rus, and they're often combined with knights. Knights that, Genoese crossbows are already bad against. So it's funny to me that this is like the one exception where the Genoese crossbows do poorly, because that kind of just means against Rus, I highly recommend building the regular crossbows, because not only do they do much better against the Rus knights, but also against these horse archers. This has to do with a quirk in the math, I think, for the HP. 4 shots by Genoese crossbows deal exactly 84 damage, and horse archers have 85 HP, so they all survive with 1 HP at the end. I think this might not be applicable to an actual game, but you probably already don't want to have Genoese crossbows, so that just piles on top of that. Next up, we're looking at some siege. These are Springalds, who are, performing about as well as you would expect. They're not designed to kill ranged units, they're anti-melee, so they take a ton of damage here. I put them in line formation. Technically, the splash damage hurts the regular crossbows slightly more because there's more of them, but yeah, the higher baseline damage from the Genoese crossbows kills the Springalds slightly faster. Somewhat more interesting is this next matchup against the Mangonel. Now you'd think that the splash damage from the Mangonel is gonna disproportionately hurt the regular crossbows more, but the reality is kinda that the Genoese crossbows sit so tightly together that these Mangonel shots are actually kinda extra devastating against the very high value, very expensive Genoese crossbows. But I don't know how to measure this accurately. Yeah, Mangonels are really fucking good against any kind of crossbow. Definitely more interesting is this matchup against Bombards. That's actually very counterintuitive here because, as it turns out, a Bombard shot just barely does not kill a Genoese crossbow. So each of them take 2 shots to kill, whereas the regular crossbows get straight up 1 shot. This leads to the Genoese crossbows winning this matchup against the Bombard, while the regular crossbows actually lose, which is, I think, quite interesting. And like, you know, the higher base damage probably makes it easier for the Genoese crossbows to snipe the Bombard. With higher range, they also can get into range easier. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. And you might think, you know, hey, what if I get chemistry for my Bombard? Maybe that's like something to note. Like getting chemistry against Genoese crossbows is important because then you can one-shot these Genoese crossbows. And no, that's actually not true because even with chemistry, the lead Genoese crossbows survive on 2 HP. Just barely, which is a bummer for the Bombard. Well, yeah. Also, just side note, I haven't mentioned it anywhere else, but Knights Templar ranged units actually get bonus range near fortresses, and that's 15%, and with higher base range for the Genoese crossbows, that 15% is more. So, you know, when it comes to sniping Bombards in siege situations, Genoese crossbows are significantly better than regular ones, actually. So that's kind of cool. Also, you know, for trebuchets or whatever might be attacking the fortress, although they're probably out of range, but you know what I mean. Now, in my quote-unquote research for this video, I've come across a couple of, you know, fun facts, bet you didn't know, that type of stuff for the Genoese crossbows, and I'm just gonna tag this on at the end. So, you know, we're gonna go over that because why not? I filmed it, it's going in the video. Starting out with the siege damage of regular crossbows versus Genoese crossbows. Now, both of these crossbows deal the same amount of damage per shot against buildings, but because regular crossbows are much cheaper than the Genoese ones, you actually have more, and they also have a slightly higher attack speed, so there's just a whole lot of more shots coming out from the regular crossbows up top, which actually amounts to about and siege damage that is about 80% higher than that of the Genoese crossbows. Now, does that mean you should build regular crossbows in order to siege down buildings? No, of course not. They both suck against buildings, but, you know, the regular crossbows suck slightly less. Bet you didn't know that. Also, if you had to guess, who do you think kills villagers faster? And spoiler alert, the answer is it's about the same. Also, if you film this and put those poor villagers all in a hold position, it feels very wrong. And I told myself, well, it's for science, and that feels even more wrong. Which is why, you know, let's skip to the end of this, and yeah, I killed all the units involved, so all the bad guys are dead. It's roughly the same in terms of killing speed of these 2 units. Now, having looked at all of these matchups, what did we learn from this? If you want to figure out what kind of crossbow you should be building, you can really just ask yourself one simple question. Does my opponent have a lot of knights? And I'm using the term knight very loosely here. Could also be cataphracts or Keshiks or whatever. Doesn't matter. If your opponent does have a lot of knights, you definitely want to go for the regular crossbows. They do a much, much better job fending those guys off. And that might make it seem that like the overwhelming amount of games played at like a high level or whatever would be containing more Genoese crossbows than regular ones, but it's kind of the opposite actually, because when you first hit the Castle Age, knights are a very dominant unit. You might be playing against like a knight civ, you know, like France or Rus that are building knights in Feudal Age already and bringing a lot of knights into the Castle Age with them. In that case, you don't want Genoese crossbows. Other civs like English or Japan hit Castle Age and kinda vibe with the knights that they just unlocked then. So you'd be facing a lot of, you know, lancers and an English king or mounted samurai, both of which the Genoese crossbows are much worse against. The kind of matchup where the Genoese crossbows shines is against civs like Delhi. They like to build a lot of Ghazi raiders and archers in Feudal Age, might have a few spears mixed in, and then tend to add men-at-arms when they hit Castle Age. And again, if you go through those units, Genoese crossbows are great. They do better against Ghazi raiders, even if they're not doing well. They're doing better against archers, even if they're only doing decent against them. They're great against spears and great against men-at-arms. Regular crossbows are only good against men-at-arms, and they're bad against everything else. That's the kind of unit composition you want to look out for when you have Genoese crossbows available. As the game goes longer, knights tend to take a less important role. If you take the example of Japan, in the very late game, they oftentimes go for like the infantry death ball of spears, honor bugeisha, and samurai. And against those units, regular crossbows just aren't as good as Genoese ones. So, you know, as the game progresses, you probably want to increase the amount of Genoese crossbows in your army. Another thing to keep in mind here is You don't have to go for any kind of crossbow at all if you don't want to. When you hit Castle Age, you can simply use the gold bonus for the Pilgrims and build a whole bunch of Templar Brothers. They are a good unit too, and honestly, Knights are just great in early Castle Age, I think. So why not mix some of your own in there? Also keep in mind that one of the strengths of the Republic of Genoa is that it gives you the option of the Genoese crossbow. You don't have to go for them. You can pick which crossbow you want or what combination of crossbows fits your situation. For example, one of the major factors that I think should decide how many Genoese crossbows versus regular crossbows you go for is simply your resource situation. In a high intensity game like a ranked 1v1, you oftentimes mess up your macro a little bit and end up with like a whole lot of one resource. If that resource is food, but you're kind of struggling to get any amount of gold going, regular crossbows are probably better to build, just because the gold cost of the Genoese crossbows is so intense that you can't get many of them out there. However, if it's the inverse, so you have a lot of gold but not much food, then you probably just want to build Genoese crossbows, even if you're up against, Lancers or whatever. You can kind of fix your own macro by simply building the combination of crossbows and Genoese crossbows that fits the amount of resources you have. Those are the three factors that lead to the Republic of Genoa being the most popular commandery. A solid passive that gives you a gold income that you want no matter what. A strong unit that's a jack-of-all-trades anti-infantry crossbowman, and flexibility between choices of ranged units. All of this makes the Republic of Genoa the most popular commandery among high-level players, at least as far as I can tell. I looked over about 50 games where slightly more than half of the picks were the Republic of Genoa for the Castle Age. The second most picked commandery was that for the Heavy Spearmen. Interestingly enough, in those games, the Heavy Spearmen was used basically every time, meaning that commandery really does get picked for the unit, not for the passive. It's just not as strong really compared to 30% bonus gold from Pilgrims. The distant third, of course, being the Janitor, that poor guy. He's kind of lost, doesn't have a clear role. Also, the passive for the commandery is not that strong. And as a result, which leads to the other two just simply being better options. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you now know what the deal is with them CrossBros. I certainly learned a lot from making this video, honestly. If you like that, you can subscribe to Trashcan Incorporated. We are always looking for interns, I guess. And with that, I'm out, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.